The silence was deafening in the Ashford house. It seemed that even the walls had forgotten what laughter and lively conversation sounded like. Upstairs, an 8-year-old boy was sitting on his bed, his eyes fixed on the darkness that surrounded him. Lucas Ashford hugged his knees to his chest, as if trying to protect himself from a world that seemed too big, too cold. The ticking of the clock in the living room echoed through the house, marking the seconds of a night that seemed endless. Lucas closed his eyes tightly, trying to remember his mother's voice, the warmth of her embrace. But the memories were becoming increasingly fuzzy, as if they were dissolving in time. A tear ran down the boy's cheek, followed by another and another. He let them fall freely, knowing that no one would come to check if he was all right. His father, William, rarely went upstairs these days. It was as if the second floor of the house held ghosts that he wasn't ready to face. "Mom," Lucas whispered into the empty room. "Do you miss me too?" Downstairs, William Ashford was sitting in his favorite armchair, a glass of whiskey in his right hand, and a photograph in his left. The dim light from the lamp cast dancing shadows on the face of the woman in the picture, Catherine Ashford, with her radiant smile and lively eyes. It was hard to believe that this same woman had left 3 years ago, leaving behind a void that seemed impossible to fill. William brought the glass to his lips, feeling the amber liquid burn his throat. It was a welcome sensation, something that made him feel something other than the numbness that dominated his days. His eyes never left the photograph, as if he could somehow bring Catherine back just by the power of his gaze. A solitary tear escaped, sliding slowly down William's cheek. For a moment, he allowed the emotion to overwhelm him, his body trembling slightly with the weight of the loss. But then, as if remembering where he was, he quickly dried his face with the back of his hand. Men don't cry. That's what his father always said. And now, more than ever, he needed to be strong. The sound of soft footsteps in the hallway made William straighten up in his armchair and quickly pull himself together. Mrs. Johnson, the maid who had worked for the family for years, appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of concern. "Mr. Ashford," she said softly, "dinner is ready. Shall I call Lucas?" William nodded briefly, unable to find the words. Mrs. Johnson hesitated for a moment, as if she wanted to say something more, but then turned and went upstairs. In Lucas's room, Mrs. Johnson found the boy still curled up on the bed, his eyes red from crying. Her heart squeezed when she saw the suffering on his young face. "Oh, darling," she murmured, sitting down on the edge of the bed and pulling Lucas into a hug. The boy clung to her, like a castaway to a piece of wood in a stormy sea. "Mrs. Johnson," Lucas sobbed, "why doesn't Daddy like me anymore?" The woman felt tears forming in her own eyes, but held them back. She gently pulled Lucas away, holding his face between her hands. "Lucas, your father loves you very much," she said firmly. He's suffering, just like you. Sometimes, when people are sad, they don't know how to show love." Lucas sniffled, absorbing the words. "But I miss Mom so much," he confessed in a whisper. "And Dad doesn't even seem to mind." Mrs. Johnson sighed, searching for the right words. "You know, Lucas, your mother always said that love can be found in the little things, in smiles, in gestures, even in silence. Your father may not show it, but he's full of love for you." She paused, remembering Catherine with a sad smile. "How about I tell you a story about your mother? Something you might not know?" Lucas's eyes lit up slightly, and he nodded enthusiastically. Mrs. Johnson smiled, settling down on the bed. "Well, there was this one time when you were very little, maybe a couple of years old," she began. "Your mother was planning a big surprise for your father's birthday. She spent weeks organizing everything in secret." As Mrs. Johnson recounted the story, Lucas listened intently, his eyes fixed on her as if he could see the scenes unfolding. For a moment, sadness was replaced by eager curiosity, and a small smile played on his lips. Downstairs, William heard the muffled sound of voices coming from Lucas's room. He closed his eyes, feeling a pang of guilt. It should be him upstairs, comforting his son, telling him stories about Catherine. But how could he talk about her when every memory was like a knife in his heart? He stood up abruptly, walking over to the window. The night outside was calm, the stars twinkling in the dark sky. William wondered if Catherine was there somewhere, watching over them. The thought brought a mixture of comfort and pain. "Forgive me, Catherine," he murmured to the night. "I don't know how to do this without you." Back in Lucas's room, Mrs. Johnson finished her story. "And that's how your mother managed to surprise your father, even though you almost revealed the secret," she concluded with a smile. Lucas laughed softly, the first genuine laugh in days. "Mom was amazing," he said, a touch of pride in his voice. "Yes, she was," agreed Mrs. Johnson. "And you know what? You have a lot of her in you. Your eyes, your smile, even your laugh." The words seemed to touch something deep within Lucas. He looked down at his hands, as if searching for traces of his mother in them. "Mrs. Johnson," he said after a moment, "do you think that one day Dad and I will be happy again?" The question took Mrs. Johnson by surprise, but she didn't hesitate in her answer. "Of course, dear. The love you have for each other, and the love your mother left you, is strong enough to overcome any sadness. It may take time, but you will find your way back to happiness." She stood up, holding out her hand to Lucas. "Now, how about we go downstairs for dinner? Your father is waiting." Lucas hesitated for a moment, but then took Mrs. Johnson's hand. Together, they walked down the stairs, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the silent house. In the dining room, William was already seated, his eyes fixed on his empty plate. When Lucas entered, he looked up briefly, a flash of emotion passing across his face before being quickly suppressed. Mrs. Johnson helped Lucas to sit down and then began to serve dinner. Silence hung over them, broken only by the sound of cutlery. Lucas cast furtive glances at his father, desperately wanting him to say something. Anything. But William remained silent, lost in his own thoughts. The void left by Catherine seemed more pronounced than ever, an unbridgeable chasm between father and son. As the night wore on, the Ashford house remained plunged into a melancholy stillness. But beneath the surface, the seeds of change had already been planted. In an upstairs bedroom, a boy fell asleep with new stories about his mother echoing in his mind. And in an armchair in the living room, a man struggled with his demons, unaware that his son could be the key to his redemption. The first chapter was coming to an end, but Lucas and William's journey had only just begun. A journey of pain, discovery, and, perhaps, healing. Night fell over the Ashford house, bringing with it a stillness that seemed to amplify every little sound. Lucas was lying in his bed, his open eyes fixed on the ceiling, while his mind wandered through memories and unanswered questions. Dinner had been another exercise in silence, with his father barely lifting his eyes from his plate. Lucas turned over in bed, feeling the weight of loneliness that seemed to grow with each passing day. He wondered if he would ever feel the warmth of a father's embrace again, or hear William's voice telling stories before bed, as he used to when his mother was still alive. A sudden noise in the hallway caught her attention. They were footsteps, heavy and slow, which Lucas immediately recognized as his father's. Curious, he quietly got up and opened the bedroom door a crack. William was walking down the corridor, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, towards the room at the end of the corridor, the room that was always locked. Lucas held his breath, his heart racing. That room was a mystery, a forbidden place that his father never mentioned. Careful not to make a sound, Lucas left his room and followed his father, keeping to the shadows. He watched as William took a key from his pocket and, with trembling hands, unlocked the door. For a moment the man hesitated, as if he were about to enter a battlefield. Then, with a deep sigh, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Lucas approached, his heart beating so hard that he feared his father might hear him on the other side of the door. He put his ear to the cold wood, trying to catch any sound. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then the sound of something falling to the floor startled him. Leaning over, Lucas tried to peek through the crack under the door. The light that escaped was weak, but enough for him to see his father's feet moving around the room. William seemed to be fiddling with something, perhaps a box or drawer. Suddenly, Lucas heard a sound he hadn't expected, a muffled sob. Was his father crying? The idea seemed so strange, so out of place with the image of the strong, distant man he knew, that Lucas almost didn't believe his own ears. Taking a few more risks, Lucas knelt down and tried to look through the keyhole. What he saw made his heart squeeze. William was sitting on the floor, surrounded by scattered papers and photographs. In his hands trembled a photo that Lucas recognized immediately. It was his mother, Catherine, with a radiant smile that lit up her whole face. Lucas felt tears welling up in his eyes. That was the expression he was trying so desperately to remember, the smile that seemed to have disappeared from his memories. Seeing the photo caused a wave of longing to hit him full force. William, oblivious to his son's presence on the other side of the door, ran his fingers gently over the photograph, as if he could somehow feel the texture of Catherine's skin. Her tears fell silently, staining the papers scattered around her. "Catherine," Lucas heard his father murmur, his voice choked with emotion. "How can I go on without you? How can I be the father Lucas deserves when I feel so lost?" The words hit Lucas like a punch in the gut. So his father felt lost too. Did he also suffer from his mother's absence? Why then did he remain so distant? A sudden movement from William made Lucas back away quickly. He ran back to his room, closing the door quietly. Lying on his bed, his heart still racing, Lucas tried to process what he had witnessed. His father, the man who seemed so cold and distant, held a world of pain locked away in that room. The letters, the photos, the tears, all of it was proof that William still loved Catherine deeply, and that her absence affected him as much as it did Lucas. The hours passed slowly as Lucas replayed these thoughts in his mind. The sound of the locked bedroom door opening and closing again marked William's return to his own room. The house fell silent once again, but for Lucas, silence now had a different meaning. When the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate through the curtains, Lucas still hadn't slept. His mind was buzzing with questions and possibilities. He needed to know more. He needed to understand why his father hid his feelings so deeply. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced that Mrs. Johnson had arrived to prepare breakfast. Lucas got up, determined to talk to her. If anyone could help him understand his father, it would be Mrs. Johnson. He found her in the kitchen, busy preparing breakfast. When she saw Lucas, she smiled warmly. "Good morning, dear. You're up early today, aren't you?" Lucas nodded hesitantly. "Mrs. Johnson, may I ask you a question?" Her expression softened, noticing the seriousness on the boy's face. "Of course, Lucas. What's bothering you?" "It's about Dad," Lucas began, the words coming out in a rush. "Last night I saw him come into the locked room. He was crying and looking at pictures of Mom. Why does he hide it from me? Why does he act as if he doesn't care?" Mrs. Johnson sighed deeply, putting aside what she was doing. She sat down at the kitchen table and motioned for Lucas to do the same. "Oh, Lucas," she said softly, "your father cares much more than you realize. Sometimes when people are in a lot of pain, they think the only way to deal with it is to hide their feelings." Lucas frowned, trying to understand. But why? Wouldn't it be better if we could talk about Mom together? Miss her together? Mrs. Johnson smiled sadly. Yes, it would. But for your father, talking about your mother is like reopening a very painful wound. He probably thinks he's protecting you by not showing his sadness. But I don't need protection, Lucas exclaimed in frustration. I need my father. Mrs. Johnson reached out and gently took Lucas's hand. I know, dear, and I believe that deep down, your father knows it too. Maybe he just needs a little push to realize that you two need each other now more than ever. Lucas absorbed the words, a new determination growing in his chest. How can I do that, Mrs. Johnson? How can I help Dad understand? She smiled, seeing the glimmer of hope in the boy's eyes. Well, how about we start with something simple? We could prepare your father's favorite breakfast. Sometimes it's the small gestures that open the door to bigger conversations. Lucas nodded enthusiastically, getting up from his chair. Can I help you? Please? Of course you can, Mrs. Johnson laughed softly. Come on, help me sort out the ingredients for the blueberry pancakes. They were your mother's favorite too, you know. As they worked together in the kitchen, Lucas felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. Perhaps with patience and love, he could find a way into his father's closed heart. Perhaps together they could begin to fill the void left by Catherine. The aroma of pancakes began to spread through the house, bringing with it memories of happier mornings. And upstairs, William Ashford woke up, smelling something other than the loneliness that consumed him for the first time in a long time. The scent of blueberry pancakes hung in the air, filling the Ashford house with a fragrance that hadn't been felt for a long time. Lucas was sitting at the kitchen table, his legs dangling nervously as he waited for his father to arrive. Mrs. Johnson, busy with the final preparations for breakfast, cast comforting glances in the boy's direction. Remember, Lucas, she said softly, sometimes it takes patience to open a closed heart. Lucas nodded, swallowing. His heart was pounding in his chest, a mixture of anxiety and hope pulsing through his veins. He so wanted this moment to be different, that somehow the pancakes could be the catalyst for a change in his relationship with his father. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made Lucas straighten up in his chair. William entered the kitchen, his tired face and slightly puffy eyes the silent witnesses of another sleepless night. For a brief moment, he stopped in the doorway, surprised by the scene before him. Good morning, Mr. Ashford, Mrs. Johnson greeted with a warm smile. Lucas and I prepared breakfast today. I hope you don't mind. William blinked, his gaze shifting from Mrs. Johnson to Lucas, who was watching him expectantly. No, I don't mind, he replied, his voice hoarse. Thanks. He sat down at the table, facing Lucas. The boy could feel the tension in the air, thick as a morning mist. Gathering all his courage, Lucas decided to break the silence. Daddy, he began, his voice shaking slightly. We made blueberry pancakes. Mrs. Johnson said they were Mom's favorite. William froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. For a moment, a shadow of pain crossed his face, so quickly that Lucas almost didn't notice. Then slowly, he lowered his fork. Yes, William said softly. They were her favorites. Silence fell over them again, heavy and uncomfortable. Lucas fiddled with his food, gathering the courage to continue the conversation. Mrs. Johnson, sensing the tension, discreetly left the kitchen, leaving father and son alone. Dad, Lucas tried again. I wanted to ask you something. William looked up from his plate, meeting his son's anxious gaze. What is it, Lucas? The boy took a deep breath, the words he had rehearsed so many times in his mind now seeming inadequate. I saw some photos last night of Mom in the locked room. William's face paled visibly. His eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and something Lucas couldn't identify. Fear, perhaps, passed through them. "Did you go into that room?" William asked, his voice tense. Lucas quickly shook his head. "No, I didn't. I only saw through the crack in the door when you were in there." William was silent for a long moment, his fingers gripping his fork so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "Lucas, that room, the things in there, aren't for you to see." "But why?" Lucas asked, frustration growing in his chest. "Why can't we talk about Mom? Why do we have to pretend she never existed?" The words came out louder and more accusatory than Lucas had intended. He saw his father flinch as if he had been physically hit. "It's not that," William said, his voice shaking slightly. "We're not pretending she never existed. It's complicated, Lucas." "But I miss her," Lucas exclaimed, tears starting to form in his eyes. "And I know you do too. I saw you crying last night. Why can't we miss her together?" William stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the kitchen floor. His face was pale, his eyes shining with restrained emotion. "Enough, Lucas," he said, his voice firm but trembling. "This matter is closed." He turned to leave the kitchen, but stopped when he heard the muffled sound of a sob. Looking over his shoulder, he saw Lucas with his face buried in his hands, his small shoulders shaking with crying. For a moment, William hesitated. His hand went up, as if to reach out and comfort his son. But then, as if remembering something painful, he dropped his hand. With one last tormented look at Lucas, he left the kitchen. Lucas stood alone at the table, the blueberry pancakes cooling on his plate, forgotten. He didn't hear Mrs. Johnson re-enter the kitchen, nor did he feel her wrap him in a tight hug. "Oh, darling," she murmured, stroking his hair. "I'm so sorry. Sometimes pain makes people act in ways we don't understand." Lucas clung to her, his tears wetting Mrs. Johnson's apron. "Why doesn't he love me anymore?" he sobbed. "Why doesn't he want to talk about Mom?" Mrs. Johnson gently pulled Lucas away, holding his face between her hands. "Lucas, look at me," she said firmly. "Your father loves you very much, more than you can imagine. He's suffering, just like you. Sometimes, when people are in a lot of pain, they close themselves off because they think they'll suffer less." Lucas sniffled, trying to process Mrs. Johnson's words. "But that doesn't make sense," he said. "Being alone only makes it hurt more." Mrs. Johnson smiled sadly. "You're right, Lucas. And one day your father will realize that too. But until then, we need to be patient and show him that love can heal, not hurt." She stood up, holding out her hand to Lucas. "Come on, let's go for a walk in the garden. The fresh air will do you good." As they walked through the garden, Lucas observed the flowers that his mother used to tend so lovingly. Some of them were wilting, neglected since Catherine's death. Suddenly, an idea popped into his head. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, stopping suddenly. "What if I looked after the garden, like Mom used to?" Mrs. Johnson looked at him in surprise. "That would be wonderful, Lucas. But are you sure you want to do that?" Lucas nodded, determined. "Yes. Maybe. Maybe if I do the things Mom used to do, Dad will see that it's okay to remember her, that we can keep her alive in our memories." Mrs. Johnson smiled, her eyes shining with pride and tenderness. "That's a very nice idea, Lucas. And you know what? I think your mother would be very proud of you." That afternoon, while Lucas dedicated himself to pulling weeds and watering neglected flowers, William watched him from his office window. His heart squeezed at the sight of his son tending the garden that Catherine loved so much. For a moment, the image of Lucas overtook the memory of Catherine, smiling as she tended to her flowers. William felt tears burning in his eyes, but he quickly brushed them away. He turned away from the window and went back to the pile of work on his desk, trying to ignore the conflict that was growing in his chest. The day was coming to an end, but Lucas and William's journey to reconnect was just beginning. The seeds of change had been planted, just like the new flowers in the garden. Now only time would tell whether they would bloom or wither under the weight of unresolved grief. The sun was setting over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, while Lucas finished watering the last flowers in the garden. His hands were dirty with dirt, but his eyes shone with a satisfaction he hadn't felt for a long time. Over the last few days, he had dedicated every free moment to the garden, slowly resurrecting his mother's legacy. On the other side of the office window, William watched his son in silence. His heart was torn between pride at seeing Lucas so dedicated and the stabbing pain that the sight of the revived garden brought. Each blooming flower was like a ghost of Catherine, beautiful and painful at the same time. When Lucas entered the house, William quickly moved away from the window, returning to his desk. He heard his son's footsteps in the hallway, approaching his study. There was a pause, a moment's hesitation, and then a soft knock on the door. "Come in," William said, his voice huskier than he had intended. Lucas opened the door slowly, still dirty with dirt. His eyes met his father's, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to say. I finished watering the flowers," Lucas finally said, his voice low but determined. "I think Mom would be happy to see the garden like this." William felt his throat close up. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words seemed stuck in his chest. After a moment that seemed like an eternity, he managed to nod. "I'm sure it is, Lucas," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence fell between them again, heavy with unspoken words. Lucas fiddled nervously with the hem of his dirty t-shirt, gathering his courage for what he wanted to say next. "Dad," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I found something in the garden. Something of Mom's." William straightened up in his chair, his attention fully focused on Lucas now. "What did you find?" Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. When he held it out to William, the man felt his heart stop for a moment. It was a ring, a simple silver ring with a small blue stone. "It's the ring you gave Mom the day you met," Lucas said softly. "She told me the story once." William picked up the ring with trembling hands, memories flooding his mind. He remembered the day he met Catherine, the nervousness he felt when he gave her the ring, her radiant smile when she accepted it. It was a symbol of a love that he believed would last forever. I thought she'd lost it," William muttered, more to himself than to Lucas. Lucas stepped forward hesitantly. "She must have lost it while she was tending the garden." "Dad, I was wondering if you could tell me about that day, about how you met Mom." William lifted his eyes from the ring, meeting his son's hopeful gaze. For a moment, he wanted to refuse, to go back to the cold comfort of the silence he had built around himself. But something in Luke's gaze, something so reminiscent of Catherine, made him hesitate. William began, his voice failing. He huffed and tried again. "I met her in a bookstore. She was looking for a book of poetry, and I offered to help." Lucas sat in the chair in front of the table, his eyes fixed on his father, absorbing every word. "Your mother had the most beautiful smile I've ever seen," William continued, his voice gaining strength as the memories flowed. "She laughed when I tried to impress her with my knowledge of literature. She said she preferred someone who could admit when they didn't know something." A small smile appeared on William's lips, the first Lucas had seen in a long time. "We talked for hours that day. When I realized it was getting dark, I panicked. I didn't want her to leave." "And that's when you gave her the ring?" Lucas asked, leaning forward in his chair. William nodded. "I'd bought it weeks before, planning to give it to someone special when I met her. At that moment, I knew it was her. I took the ring out of my pocket and said that if she accepted it, I promised to spend the rest of my life trying to make her smile like she had that day." Lucas felt tears forming in his eyes. "And she did." "Yes," William said softly. "She did." Silence fell over them again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of before, but a silence full of shared memories and raw emotions. "Dad," Lucas said after a moment, his voice shaking slightly. "I miss her so much." William felt something break inside him. The walls he had built around his heart began to crumble. Before he could stop himself, he stood up and came around the table, pulling Lucas into a tight hug. "I miss her too, son," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I miss her so much that sometimes I can hardly breathe." Lucas clung to his father, letting the tears flow freely. For so long, he had longed for this moment, this connection. William held his son tightly, as if he feared he might disappear if he let go. When they finally separated, both of their eyes were red and moist. William knelt in front of Lucas, holding his shoulders gently. "Lucas, I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I shouldn't have walked away from you. I thought that if we didn't talk about her, maybe the pain would be less. But I was wrong." Lucas nodded, wiping away the tears with the back of his dirt-stained hand. "It's okay, Dad. I understand." William shook his head. "No, it's not okay. But we'll get better, okay? Together." At that moment, Mrs. Johnson appeared in the office doorway, her eyes widening as she saw the scene before her. William stood up quickly, clearing his throat. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice still a little hoarse, "I think Lucas and I would like to have dinner in the garden tonight. We could talk more about Catherine." Mrs. Johnson smiled, her eyes shining with restrained tears. "Of course, Mr. Ashford, I'll get everything ready." As she walked away, William turned to Lucas. "How about you show me what you did in the garden before dinner?" Lucas's face lit up with a smile that warmed William's heart. "Of course, Dad. Come on. I want to show you the roses Mom planted. They're beautiful." Father and son left the office together, heading for the garden that now symbolized not only Catherine's memory, but also the beginning of a new connection between them. The silver ring rested securely in William's pocket, a tangible reminder of the love that bound them together and the promise of better days to come. As the sun set completely, casting soft shadows over the revived garden, William and Lucas began to rebuild their relationship, word by word, memory by memory. The pain of loss was still there, but now there was also hope. Hope that together they could honor Catherine's memory and find a path to healing. Morning came with a softness that seemed new to the Ashford household. The sun's golden rays seeped through the curtains, illuminating Lucas's room with a warm glow. The boy woke up slowly, blinking against the light, a smile forming on his lips as he remembered the night before. Dinner in the garden had been a moment of revelation and connection. William, for the first time in years, had opened up, sharing stories about Catherine that Lucas had never heard before. The sound of his father's laughter, something he barely remembered, echoed in his memory like a precious melody. Lucas stood up, full of an energy he hadn't felt for a long time. He dressed quickly and went downstairs, anxious to see if the magic of the night before still lingered in the daylight. When he entered the kitchen, he found Mrs. Johnson preparing breakfast. The smell of toast and coffee filled the air, mingling with the fresh scent of garden flowers wafting in through the open window. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," Lucas greeted, his voice full of enthusiasm. Mrs. Johnson turned around, a warm smile on her face. "Good morning, dear. Did you sleep well?" Lucas nodded, taking an apple from the fruit bowl. "Where's Dad?" "He left early for a walk in the garden," she replied, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. "He said he wanted to see the sunrise among the flowers you looked after." Lucas's heart filled with a joy he could hardly contain. His father, who had avoided the garden and everything it represented for so long, was now willingly embracing it. "Can I go and find him?" Lucas asked, already moving towards the door. Mrs. Johnson nodded. "Of course, dear. Breakfast will be ready when you get back." Lucas ran out into the garden, his bare feet feeling the fresh dew on the grass. He found his father sitting on a stone bench, gazing at a bed of roses that Catherine had planted years ago. William looked up when he heard Lucas approach, a soft smile forming on his face. "Good morning, son." "Good morning, Dad," Lucas replied, taking a seat next to him. For a moment they sat in silence, absorbing the quiet beauty of the morning. "You know," William began, his voice soft, "your mother used to say that the garden was like our life. It needed constant care, love, and patience to flourish." Lucas looked at his father, seeing a vulnerability in his eyes that he had never noticed before. "And we stopped looking after it, didn't we?" William nodded slowly. "Yes, we stopped. But you, Lucas, you brought life back to this place, just as you're bringing life back to me." The words hit Lucas like a ray of sunshine, warming him from the inside. He leaned against his father, feeling William's arm wrap around him in a hug. "Dad," Lucas said after a moment, "I wanted to show you something." He stood up and guided William to a small flower bed hidden behind a bush. There, sprouting timidly, were several seedlings of a flower that William recognized immediately. "They're lilies of the valley," he whispered, the emotion clear in his voice. "Your mother's favorites." Lucas nodded, proud. "I found some seeds in a box in the attic. Mrs. Johnson helped me plant them." William knelt down, gently touching the delicate leaves. "Catherine always said they symbolized the return of happiness," he murmured, more to himself than to Lucas. At that moment, something shifted in the air between them. It was as if an invisible barrier had finally broken down, allowing Catherine's memories to flow freely, no longer as painful ghosts, but as comforting presences. "Lucas," William said, standing up and looking into his son's eyes, "I think it's time we opened that room. Together." Lucas's heart leapt. The locked room, the sanctuary of his mother's memories that had been forbidden for so long, would finally be revealed. They walked back to the house in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Mrs. Johnson watched them pass through the kitchen, a smile of understanding on her face. Before the bedroom door, William hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he held the key. Lucas held his father's other hand, offering silent support. With a deep sigh, William unlocked the door and opened it. The room was exactly as Catherine had left it. Books piled up on the bedside table, a coat thrown casually over a chair, bottles of perfume lined up on the dressing table. The air was heavy with the smell of old books and a faint hint of Catherine's favorite perfume. Lucas entered slowly, his wide eyes trying to absorb every detail. William stood in the doorway for a moment, fighting the wave of emotions that threatened to engulf him. "She's everywhere here," William whispered, finally entering the room. Lucas approached the dressing table, picking up one of the perfume bottles. He opened it carefully and inhaled, closing his eyes. "It's like she's here," he said softly. William joined him, taking a hairbrush from the dressing table. Golden strands were still stuck in it, glinting in the light coming through the window. "Your hair," William said, his voice breaking. "She always complained that it was too unruly." Lucas smiled, remembering. She used to say that I inherited it from her. They spent the whole morning in the bedroom, William sharing stories about every object they found. A pair of earrings he had given Catherine on their first wedding anniversary, a book of poetry with underlined passages and notes in the margins, a music box that played her favorite melody. Each object was a window into the past, a chance for Lucas to get to know better the mother he had lost so early, and for William to reconnect with the love he had tried to bury along with the pain. When they finally left the room hours later, they were both emotionally exhausted, but there was a lightness in their hearts that they hadn't felt for years. "Thank you, Dad," Lucas said, hugging William tightly, "for sharing this with me." William kissed the top of his son's head, silent tears streaming down his face. "Thank you for reminding me that it's possible to miss her without letting the pain consume us." They walked down the stairs hand in hand, finding Mrs. Johnson in the living room. She looked at them with a mixture of concern and hope. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly. William nodded, a small smile on his lips. "Yes, Mrs. Johnson. I think it finally is." Lucas ran to hug Mrs. Johnson, his voice animated as he began to tell her about all the things they had discovered in the room. As Lucas spoke, William moved closer to the window, looking out at the garden. The lilies of the valley that Lucas had planted seemed more vibrant now, their small white flowers swaying gently in the breeze. "The return of happiness," he murmured to himself, feeling for the first time in years that maybe, just maybe, Catherine was right. Happiness was returning, not like a sudden storm, but like a gentle spring rain, nourishing the seeds of healing that had been dormant for so long. William turned to look at his son, seeing in him not only Catherine's reflection, but also the promise of a future that finally didn't seem so bleak. With a sigh of relief, he joined Lucas and Mrs. Johnson, ready to face whatever the future held, no longer alone, but as a family united by the memory of the love they shared. The days that followed the opening of Catherine's room were like a dream for Lucas. The Ashford house, once so silent and oppressive, now seemed to breathe with new life. The laughter that had been absent for so long echoed through the corridors, bringing with it a sense of lightness that Lucas could hardly remember having experienced before. William, as if awakened from a long sleep, spent every moment he could with his son. Together, they explored Catherine's memories, turning mourning into a celebration of the life she had lived. Meals, once moments of uncomfortable silence, were now filled with shared stories and memories. One sunny afternoon, Lucas found his father in the study, leaning over a box of old photographs. The boy approached silently, observing the expressions that passed across William's face: joy, nostalgia, and a hint of sadness that never seemed to disappear completely. "Dad?" Lucas called softly, not wanting to break the moment. William looked up, a soft smile forming on his lips as he saw his son. "Hey, champ, want to see some old photos?" Lucas nodded enthusiastically, pulling up a chair to sit next to his father. William slung his arm around his son's shoulders, bringing him close as he leafed through the album. "Look," William said, pointing to a photo. "This is your mother the day we met. Remember I told you about the bookstore?" Lucas leaned in to get a better look. In the photo, Catherine was smiling radiantly, her eyes shining with an infectious joy. She held a book of poetry in one hand and, in the other, the small silver ring that Lucas had found in the garden. "She looks so happy," Lucas murmured, touching the photo gently. William nodded, his voice soft with remembrance. She was always like that, full of life. She knew how to find beauty in the simplest things. They spent hours like this, William sharing the stories behind each photograph. Lucas absorbed everything eagerly, feeling that he was finally getting to know the mother he had lost so early. However, as the days passed, Lucas began to notice something that bothered him. As he and his father revisited Catherine's memories, it seemed as if they were only looking at the past. The walls of the house were still bare, without any family photos. The present and the future seemed as empty as before. One morning, while helping Mrs. Johnson clean out the attic, Lucas found an old family photo album. Curious, he opened it, hoping to find more memories to share with his father. To his surprise and disappointment, the pages were blank. "Mrs. Johnson," he called out, showing her the empty album. "Why are there no photos here?" Mrs. Johnson approached, a look of understanding passing across her face. "Oh dear," she said softly. "That was the album your mother bought just before. Well, before she left us. She wanted to fill it with new family memories." Lucas felt a knot forming in his throat. "But it's empty now," he muttered. Mrs. Johnson knelt down beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "this is a sign that it's time to create new memories, not just relive old ones." Mrs. Johnson's words echoed in Lucas's mind for the rest of the day. He watched his father, noticing how William seemed to oscillate between moments of joy when sharing memories of Catherine and periods of deep melancholy, as if he were losing himself in the past. That night, unable to sleep, Lucas got up and went to his bedroom window. The full moon bathed the garden in a silvery light, making the flowers seem almost ethereal. It was then that an idea began to form in his mind. The next morning, Lucas woke up early, determined to put his plan into action. He found Mrs. Johnson in the kitchen and, with eyes sparkling with enthusiasm, shared his idea with her. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice full of anticipation, "I think I know how we can help Dad look to the future, not just the past." Mrs. Johnson smiled, intrigued. "And how will we do that, dear?" Lucas explained his plan. They would organize a special evening with his father's favorite dinner and a movie that his mother loved. But most importantly, Lucas wanted to take new photos, to start filling that empty album with new memories. "That's a wonderful idea, Lucas," Mrs. Johnson said, her eyes shining with pride. "Your mother would be so happy to see you taking care of your father like this." With Mrs. Johnson's help, Lucas spent the day getting everything ready. They cooked William's favorite roast, tidied up the living room for a cozy movie night, and Lucas even found his mother's old camera in the attic. When William arrived home from work, he was greeted by the delicious aroma coming from the kitchen and the soft sound of a song Catherine used to listen to. He stopped at the door, surprised and moved by the scene he found. Lucas ran to hug him, a beaming smile on his face. "Surprise, Dad. We've prepared a special evening for us." William looked around, noticing the small details that evoked memories of Catherine, but also noticing something new, something that spoke of hope and a future he had hardly dared to imagine. Over dinner, Lucas talked animatedly about his plans for the summer, about the new friends he had made at school, about his dreams for the future. William listened to him, feeling a mixture of pride and a twinge of guilt for having been so absent in recent years. After dinner, they settled down on the sofa to watch Catherine's favorite movie. Lucas snuggled up next to his father, feeling safe and loved in a way he hadn't felt for a long time. In the middle of the movie, Lucas took out his camera and took a picture of the two of them together. The flash surprised William, who looked at his son with a confused expression. "What was that, Lucas?" he asked. Lucas smiled, showing the camera to his father. "I thought it was time we started creating new memories, Dad, to fill that empty album Mom left behind." William was silent for a moment, a deep emotion flashing through his eyes. Then, slowly, a smile formed on his lips. "You're right, son," he said softly. "Your mother would want us to go on living, not just remembering." They spent the rest of the evening taking silly photos, laughing and creating new memories. When Lucas finally went to bed, he felt light and hopeful. The next day, William surprised Lucas by coming home with a new picture frame. Together, they chose one of the photos they had taken the night before and hung it on the living room wall next to a photo of Catherine. Looking at the two photos side by side, the past and the present, Lucas felt that they were finally on the right track. The puzzle of their emotions, so confusing and painful for so long, was beginning to form a picture of hope and healing. While father and son admired their work, Mrs. Johnson watched them from the kitchen door, a satisfied smile on her face. She knew that the road ahead would still be difficult with ups and downs, but the seed of healing had been planted. And as Catherine always said, with love, patience, and care, even the most fragile seeds can blossom into something beautiful. The sun slowly set over the horizon, tinging the sky with shades of orange and purple, as Lucas hurried into the kitchen, his small hands working with determination. He was determined to make the evening as special as possible. With Mrs. Johnson's help, he had planned a dinner that combined his father's and mother's favorite dishes, a way of paying tribute to them both. "Almost all done, dear," Mrs. Johnson said, adjusting the tablecloth with a smile. "You did a great job organizing everything." "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. I hope Dad likes it," Lucas replied, his heart racing with anticipation. He was excited, but also nervous. The evening meant a lot to him, as it was an opportunity to create a deeper connection with William. When the doorbell rang, Lucas almost jumped for joy. "He's here!" he shouted, running to open the door. William was standing outside, an expression of surprise on his face at the sight of the carefully laid table and the scent of fresh dinner filling the air. "Wow, Lucas. What's going on here?" he asked, a smile forming on his lips. "Surprise. I've prepared a special dinner for the two of us," Lucas said, his eyes shining with excitement. William walked in, looking around in awe. "You did all this? It's incredible, son." "Let's eat. Mrs. Johnson helped, but I did a few things myself," Lucas replied, pulling his father to the table. As they sat down, William looked at his plate, which was full of his favorite dishes: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and Catherine's famous blueberry pancakes, decorated with a touch of love. "These pancakes? I haven't seen them for years," William murmured, his voice laden with emotion. Lucas leaned forward. "I thought you'd like them. Mom loved making them for us, didn't she?" William nodded, his eyes getting lost for a moment in the memories the food evoked. "Yes, she loved it. She always said that food was a way of showing love." The conversation flowed naturally as they shared stories about Catherine, laughing and remembering the little things that made her special. Lucas talked about how his mother used to dance in the kitchen while she cooked, and William smiled as he remembered how Catherine often pulled him along to dance. After dinner, Lucas got up and went to the living room, where he had prepared a cozy space to watch the movie his mother loved. Everything was ready: cushions spread out on the floor, blankets, and, of course, the old box of movies that Catherine had left behind. "Let's watch something fun," Lucas suggested, picking up the box. "I think you'll like it." William joined him, his heart warmed by his son's vibrant energy. He was beginning to realize that those little traditions, those simple moments, were what really mattered. "Which movie did you choose?" William asked, looking at the covers. "One of Mom's favorites. Life is Beautiful," Lucas replied, his enthusiasm evident. "She always said it was a movie about love and hope, and that we should always remember to find joy, even in difficult situations." William hesitated for a moment. The movie was a powerful reminder of love and loss, but also of resilience. He remembered the first time he watched it with Catherine, holding her hand as the tears flowed. But looking at Lucas, he felt the moment was right. "Sure, let's watch," he said, deciding it was time to face the feelings he had tried to avoid. As the screen lit up the room, they settled down comfortably. Lucas snuggling against his father. The movie started, and the laughter and emotional moments enveloped them in a shared nostalgia. As the movie progressed, William felt the knots of his pain and guilt begin to unravel. He saw the beauty in the story of love and sacrifice, and determination in the midst of adversity. Looking at Lucas, he realized that, like the protagonist, they too could find joy and hope in the midst of pain. However, as the movie approached its emotional climax, William began to feel tears streaming down his face. He couldn't help it. The scene in which the father does everything to protect his son during the war hit him hard. It was a painful reminder of how much he had failed to protect Lucas from the pain of losing his mother. "Dad, are you okay?" Lucas asked, looking at him with concern. William quickly wiped away the tears, trying to smile. "Yes, son. Just a bit emotional." Lucas smiled softly, understanding that his father was also dealing with his emotions. "It's okay to cry, Dad. Mom always said that tears are like rain. They help cleanse." Lucas's words touched William deeply. He realized that his son was learning to deal with pain in a wise and mature way. "You're absolutely right," William agreed. "Sometimes we need to allow the tears to flow so that we can feel lighter." When the movie came to an end, Lucas was bright-eyed, but also emotional. "It was amazing, Dad. Mom loved that movie. I remembered all the times we watched it together." William nodded, his heart full of love and longing. "She really loved it. And you, Lucas, are becoming more and more like her every day. I just want you and me to be happy again, like we were before," Lucas said, his voice full of sincerity. "We will, son." "I promise," William replied, holding the boy's hand. "Together, we'll find our way back to happiness." After cleaning up the room, Lucas remembered something important. "Dad, do you remember the album we found in the attic?" "Yes, of course," William replied, puzzled. "I thought we should start filling it with new memories. We could take a photo of the two of us now and put it in there," Lucas suggested, his enthusiasm brimming over. William smiled, surprised by the idea. "That's a great idea, Lucas. Let's do it." Lucas took the camera he had found earlier and adjusted the settings. He positioned himself next to his father, both making faces and smiling, capturing the joy of the moment. "1, 2, 3, Lucas shouted, pressing the button and capturing an image that would become a new memory for the album. "Perfect! Now let's print it out and put it in the front of the album," Lucas said excitedly. As they prepared to print the photo, William looked at Lucas, his heart overflowing with love. He realized that although the pain of Catherine's loss was still there, the connection he was forming with his son was a way of honoring her memory. "You know, Lucas, your mother always said that love is a cycle. Even when someone leaves, the love we have for them never disappears. It lives on through us," William said, his voice soft. Lucas smiled, understanding. "And I want her to know that we always love her, even if she's not here." "She knows, my son, and she always will," William replied, feeling a wave of peace. That night, as they prepared for bed, Lucas looked at the photo album next to his bed, now with a new picture stuck to the front. He felt light, hopeful, and full of love. The pain of his mother's absence was still there, but now there was also room for new memories and new connections. William, lying in his own bed, reflected on the night. He was beginning to see a path ahead, a path that wasn't just about looking at the past, but also about building a future. He knew the healing process would be long, but he was ready to face it alongside Lucas. The connection they had created that night was an important step for both of them. And as the stars twinkled in the sky above, William felt that with love, patience, and the courage to open up, they could find a new beginning together. Did this narrative stir your emotions? Don't forget to express your approval with a like. Take advantage of the Super Thanks feature, available just below the video, to offer direct support to the channel and contribute to the production of more fascinating content. Subscribe and remember to activate the bell to stay up to date with all the latest updates. And attention, a new exciting story is already ready to be displayed on your screen. Your participation means a lot to me, and I hope to count on your presence soon. Thank you very much for dedicating your time to this video.